Good morning. It's really good to be here. So I'm going to tell you stories, and the reason I want to focus on stories is because both you get information from stories, but I think they also can be a source of inspiration. So I'm going to aim for your head, but I'm also hoping to reach your heart and bring us back to the reconnection that we need with nature and with each other. And seeds are an embodied story. So I hope you're going to go away today with a completely different understanding of the role of seeds, and also maybe stories and how we connect with each other. Why seeds? Because, people think, well, we need air, we need water, we need land, we need sun. But people forget how important seeds are. I call it the fifth dimension, It's sort of an invisible world. But seeded plants provide us with our food, we know that. But they also provide us with fuel and fiber and medicine. And seeded plants even provide us with the air we breathe. But they're pretty invisible to us, and so we take them for granted. I hope to make that apparent today about how important they are to our world. Now I'm going to get started really early on, back to, before I do this, I'm sorry. I want to tell you a little bit about myself and why I care so much. I come from a long line of plant-loving women. My mother and my sisters are gardeners. One sister was a professional horticulturist, and we've always been involved in growing things. But in my work as a lawyer, I represented traditional native healers who also, this is me with Florence Jones, who was a Wintu healer. In our tradition, they studied plants. She studied plants for 38 years before she began her healing. So we don't have that kind of tradition in our medicine of such long, intense study. But she did that, and I learned a lot from her about their plants. And also in my work as a journalist, I've been covering plants, and I've been actually studying and reporting on GMOs for almost 20 years. So we'll be talking about all of those things. And during that time, I've had one very core value, which I want to share with you, and that is this inherent integrity of the natural world. And that's why I was so concerned about GMOs and other technologies. There's more online coming down the pipe. They're even worse than GMOs, I'm sorry to say. But they all are affecting not only our personal health, but our planetary health. So I want to take us all the way back to a very early story, the Garden of Eden, probably one of the best known creation stories from the biblical book of Genesis. And we all know about this garden, or most of us do, where there's this harmony in nature and where animals and people get along and there's all this abundance. And like most creation stories, there's a catch. All of them have a little thing where people are supposed to do something right, and then they don't do it, and then they pay the price. So it's always really interesting what happens. And at the end of my talk, I'm going to come back to what really happened in that particular story. But just remember that this narrative has a lot to do with how we think about the natural world and our place in it. In this story, of course, we're told that Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, and that then we have to feed ourselves by the sweat of our brow. So I want to just emphasize that we have this negative idea of ourselves and how we feed ourselves that comes from this story. Maybe there's another way to look at this. Also, the book of Genesis refers to 4 rivers in the Middle East. Now, there are a lot of places in Bible stories that are actually located in the Middle East, and you can find them. And satellite data and biblical scholars have narrowed down this area between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers to an area probably most likely the one in southern Iraq, which was a moist and fertile valley thousands of years ago. And this area is also known as the Fertile Crescent. Now, we know that agriculture arose all over the world in different places. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. But everywhere in the world, like in the Americas, there's corn, rice from Southeast Asia and Africa, and all these other places where people and plants engaged and domesticated the plants and animals that give us our food supply now. That we count on now. These are places called the center of origin. And in the Middle East, the center of origin is for about 83 different species. Nuts like dates, lentils, peas, rye, wheat, and beans, apples, pears, and a lot of spices and medicinal plants. They all originated in the Middle East. Iraq, in particular, has a priceless seed heritage. So in the 1970s, the Minister of Agriculture of Iraq went all over the Middle East and collected these ancient seeds. 1,400 different accessions of unique varieties from all over the Middle East were collected. And the Iraqi Ministry of Agriculture established a seed bank in an area right outside of Baghdad, and a breeding plant center and a botanical garden. When we invaded Iraq in 2003, we destroyed the seed bank and we destroyed the plant breeding center and the botanical garden. Now, fortunately, a few scientists smuggled out of Iraq a cardboard box with just some of the seeds that were in the seed bank, these ancient, precious heritage seeds. But unfortunately, they took them to Syria, and so they're still at peril of being destroyed because of the war in Syria. So this story also illustrates the vulnerability of seed banks to conflict zones and other problems. And it's also important because it tells us about the link between the war and agriculture, which I'll get into in a second. The location of the seed bank, though, is a place that you probably have heard about. It's Abu Ghraib. That's where the prison was as well. It's an area of great shame in American history. According to the United Nations FAO, before the United States invasion, 97%, almost 100% of Iraqi farmers saved their own seed or bought them at local markets. So Iraq was seed independent before we invaded in 2003. But we destroyed that too. L. Paul Bremer, remember him with the suit and the boots and all that guy? He spent $12 billion of our money in the first year of the U.S. occupation, $9 billion of which has never been accounted for. And I tell all these stories in my book. But basically what happened was that he wanted to reform agriculture in Iraq. And to do that, he also appointed a Cargill executive. Cargill's a big multinational grain company, to reconstruct the agriculture of Iraq. And basically what they were doing was making the Iraqi agriculture, which had been self-sufficient and seed independent, they turned it into the kind of agriculture we have in the Midwest. So that they created a dependency on Iraqi farmers on U.S. seed supply and other inputs and to sell their wheat on the international market. So this ongoing worldwide destruction of traditional agriculture is also largely invisible. This is one of the dirty secrets of war. It's linked to food systems. I saw this firsthand in Vietnam, where rice was a major part of the U.S. war and occupation in Vietnam as well. So the whole point is who controls seeds. In Iraq, of course, there's the oil and energy, water. These are all the heart of the conflicts going on around the world. And agriculture is a big part of that because, and this is something I'd like you to remember, if you want to control the food system, if you want to control a population, you can control their seed supply. You would control your seed supply if you could, if we let them. In Iraq, this was also done by imposing a new law, commonly known as Order 81. It was written by U.S. companies and U.S. agriculture policy, and it basically restricted the use of seeds by Iraqi farmers. They had to buy their seeds, and it imposed hybrid and U.S. seeds on the Iraqi agriculture. You can look it up, Order 81. How did we get from the Garden of Eden to Abu Ghraib? How do we go from this sense of abundance and harmony in nature to the kind of cruelty and power struggles that we're seeing now in the world? You know, we're really facing a very perilous time in the world today. And the United Nations has estimated that 60% of all the biological functions on Earth are seriously degraded. So we're facing some really very difficult decisions, not only in ourselves as people, but as a country and as a society. So how do we know if we're headed in the right direction? This slide illustrates some of the perils that we're facing right now. Just to summarize, we have increases in population. We've got decreases in natural resources. We've got climate change. We've got the loss of species. These are very serious threats to our well-being. And yet our response to this has not been really adequate. And one of the things I've studied as an environmental journalist is why aren't we taking effective action in dealing with these problems? One of the reasons I discovered was the way we're given information. Now, these two slides represent the kind of confusing information around climate change. It's just for instance. There's a lot of data like CO2 and, it's very abstract and it's very distant and things that are happening in other places. And I agree, I like this information. I work really hard to try and translate that information into stories that help people see the world the way it actually is functioning. I also happen to agree with this representation of Monsanto. I think it's really quite accurate. This is who they really are. But these are very distancing, and they're fear-based. And they create what psychologists call denial and distancing. They create this kind of information when you supply it to people, you create fear on their part. Now, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you can say that's done on purpose. But I think a lot of it is actually just done because people don't have a better way of talking to each other about the world we're living in and the threats that we face. So how do we make the right choices? How do we figure out where we should be headed? Okay, now these are two extremes. One is the abundance and biological world of healthy soil and clean water and good, communities. And the other is this sort of technological, I call it biological versus biotechnology. The two choices, they're extreme, and there's a big gray area in the middle where people make good choices and where a lot of us are in transition to try to transition to a more biological basis. But there's also a lot of effort to force us into technologies as the answer, the techno fixes. And if you really look at what technology has brought, especially in terms of agriculture, it's these large monocropping of GMO seeds and chemically dependent agriculture that we see, that we have now. So one thing I learned living in Vietnam is that people know how to deal with adversity and hardship. And the main thing that I saw there that I don't see so much here is the cooperation of people and communities. Surviving together and having a sense of community and reliance on each other is vital. You saw this with Katrina, you see this when disasters happening. People turn to each other on the local level. And in terms of the food system, this is what we know as the culture of agriculture. Okay, I always like to say that when you take the culture out of agriculture, all you have left is agribusiness. So part of my work is to return culture to agriculture, to put the people back in, to put the purpose back in, which is to feed people. It's fundamental. The other thing that I learned in Vietnam was the importance of rice. And I had been practicing law almost entirely when I closed my law practice and moved to Vietnam with my husband, who was in the rice business. And American Rice and the government of Vietnam went in together to help the Vietnamese with their rice business in the post-war period where there was still some starvation and scarcity in Vietnam. And it was very interesting. And I had an organic farm on the Mekong River. And I hired a water buffalo and we cleared out the area and I got to know the women of the area and I started teaching them about planting. I had to work really hard to find seeds and to find inputs that were organic because most of the area around me was industrial rice cultivation. And I really enjoyed doing that, and I would invite the village women over to the area where I lived and feed them from the garden and show them about how to grow their home vegetable gardens without using the pesticides, because these women work in the fields. I don't know if you know this or not, but in most of the world, agriculture is something that women do. They grow food for their families and their communities. In some places in Africa and Southeast Asia, 85% of agriculture is women labor. So they often will work in the commercial agriculture, and they bring home the pesticides. And in Vietnam, the pesticides weren't regulated or labeled. There was no instruction. So I would go around and I took a little survey, and some of them said, "Oh, we spray all the time. We spray as much as possible." And I go, "Oh no, this is not a good idea." It was, I was concerned about the water and the effects of pesticides, and I saw also the damage of Agent Orange that was used as an herbicide in the war. But mainly, it was actually quite an effort to put together some kind of a way for them to feed their families without having the sprays that they use to take home. But I spent a couple of years at it and was eventually successful. But it's like everything else that you do. When you do the right thing in the places where you live, there's a gift. And the gift to me was I learned about rice and the generosity of this important grass. What I think people don't know is that most of the world's food supply is grasses. Corn is a grass, wheat, and rice are the three main foods of the world. And rice really taught me a lot about the culture of agriculture. These grasses are extraordinarily generous to us. I learned that in Vietnam alone, there were 10,000 varieties of rice. There are probably over 100,000 worldwide. Some of these varieties of rice grow. Vietnam is a water world, and the floods come in, and these rice know how to grow taller and taller and taller as the water comes in. There's also drought resistance and pest resistance. And like I said last night, all that genetically modified organisms is stealing some of these wonderful gifts of nature, that the adaptation that these plants have done to their natural world, and take them and patenting them and using them and selling them back to farmers. I'll get a little bit more into that in a little bit. But rice is the kind of sacred food, like corn, where it connects people to the places they live, and it connects to each other. I saw farmers, for instance, in Southeast Asia, and they'd plant those commercial rice varieties like kamwali. I don't know if anybody's ever had that nice, fragrant rice. They plant that because they have to make a living, and then they'd plant some really special rice for their families a little bit, and then over in one little corner, they'd plant some sacred rice and ceremonial rice. So I realized that there's way more to this growing food than I had seen before I lived in this particular area. Again, it's all about the culture of agriculture. And these seeded grasses and their generosity and our relationship to them have been feeding us all along, and they still do. So the importance of seeds. Seeds have always been important. As the poet Howard Nemeroff says, they're the original monies of the earth. The sharing and exchanging of seeds is not only an inextricable part of the food system, but it's also part of local economies. I'm going to talk about how this is coming back into our lives now, but it's been part of us for 10,000 years. It's how we live on Earth. We're a seeded planet, and we're seed people. And of course, seeds are the common heritage of humanity. This crucial heritage, this is why I chose to write my book on seeds. Instead of just talking about, I care very much about all these issues of science and technology and the corruption, and I'll talk a little bit about them. But seeds, to remember something as sacred, to remember our connection to the plant world and how important it is to us, I think is such an important part of telling this story of how we got here. What happened? Why did we go from being healthy, growing food locally, to where we are now, where we're eating mostly corporate food and genetically engineered food, and food that's been, raised with pesticides? How did we get here? That's what I'm trying to get across, is what you need to know about this. And seeds are one great way to tell this story. Now, there are probably 150,000 edible plants in the world. And like I said, there are basically 3 or 4 that feed most of us, the corn, wheat. Now soy, of course, is important. But of all the thousands and thousands of edible foods that we've enjoyed over the years, 75%, actually it's closer to 80%. In the first part of the 20th century, the first couple of decades in the 20th century, we started this narrowing of the genetic diversity of seeds that we use in the food supply. And we have fewer and fewer. We used to have like 800 varieties of apples grown in the United States. And now there's maybe a dozen and just a few green and red, in the supermarket. So there's this narrowing of the genetic diversity in the food supply that's a really crucial part of the story. Actually, by some estimates, it's more like now 90% of the genetics of seeds, the genetics of plants that are valuable to people are gone. So one of the biggest causes, one cause that I don't mention here is loss of habitat and the eradication of farmland. And that's something that we need to look at as well. But basically, the main cause is seed consolidation, ownership by corporations. In 2011, when I first started using these slides, it was 10 companies owned 75%. And when I did the research for this talk, it's now down to 6 companies that own 75% of the world's, they control the sales of seeds in the world. These companies buy up all the little small seed companies, and they're not just buying the sales or the products, they're buying that germplasm, they're buying the libraries, and if it's not commercially available, they no longer will sell or keep that seed. So we're literally losing one of the most precious gifts of the earth and the planet. Now, I don't know if you've heard, but Monsanto and Syngenta are considering a merger. And this information I get is from the ETC group in Canada. And if those two companies are allowed to merge, they'd control 54%, this one company, 54% of the world's sales of seeds and the related research and development. Again, they get to choose what seeds we have, what is grown, and what we know about it. And they also then would do what they're doing now, which is raising prices and forbidding farmers from saving the seed themselves. The other thing I want you to notice about this slide is that these are all chemical companies, agrochemical companies, right? We'll talk about that in a moment. Let's stay with the seeds and the genetics for a minute. Seed banks are a very crucial part of saving the world's heritage of seeds. On your left is the Arctic Seed Bank. You probably heard about that in Svalbard. It's a backup seed bank, saving seeds from other seed banks. So seed banks take part of their collection and then send it to the Svalbard in order to back up that supply in case there's a world catastrophe. But as I mentioned before, seed banks are really vulnerable. They're vulnerable to war, conflict, flood, natural disasters, but they're also very poorly funded. Here in the United States, we're defunding our very precious seed banks. And with that comes also the loss of knowledge. One of the fun things I did when I wrote my book is I got to go seed banks. And I'd walk into these great rooms like this room here, and it'd be all quiet because there's this refrigeration, it's cold and quiet. And it was just like walking into a cathedral. I could just feel this vitality of these collections and how precious and sacred they were. It was really an amazing experience. And yet, one of the things that has to happen, I also saw, is that you have to grow out these are living organisms. All seeds are living organisms. So you have to grow them out repeatedly, make sure they germinate, get them back into the collection, and there's always a loss of germplasm when you go through that process. The other thing that's very important to understand is that very few seeds are actually good to store in cold storage. So not all the plants that we love and care about can be stored in seed banks. So what are we going to do? So on-farm seed saving, botanical gardens, and other places where they save seeds, what they call in situ, in place, are crucial to saving the seeds of the world. This is back to farmers again. They have an enormously important role. The other thing that they do when you grow seeds out on the farm and exchange them is you're developing the local adaptation of these plants. So as the climate changes, as drought comes about, you can adapt the crops that you grow. I do this in my own garden. I have lettuce that I've been growing every year, and I watch how it responds to different water and temperature changes. And, and I go, well, I'll save these seeds. It's just this, it's been this intimate relationship with seeds we've always had. It's really actually fun. I highly, even if it's just a little pot on a windowsill, I encourage you to get involved in plant growing because it's part of who we really are. The other thing that's really important about local seed saving is the local knowledge. Traditional ecological knowledge of native people, and again, native people are are vulnerable, just like seeds are vulnerable, and their knowledge, the information that they have for thousands of years, in some cases, is also disappearing along with their languages. And also, one of the things I want to mention about this, there's this farmer-to-farmer information. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Hawaii, but the other thing that's very important is to encourage the ability of farmers to talk to each other. Again, what we're saying is this expertise that the companies are trying to establish as Monsanto as the expert, we know how you should grow what you need to grow. Farmers know what they need to know, and they need to be able to talk to each other, and also not just locally, but internationally as well. This communication among people is, again, a part of the culture of agriculture that we need to preserve. So I've been asking this question, how did we get into this mess? How did we get to where we are now? And I'd like to focus on corn. It's a gift. They call it a gift. Many corn cultures call it a gift to the Americas. And I think the story of corn is another story that helps tell the story of who we are and how we got to where we are. Corn's center of origin is Mesoamerica. And the people in the area call themselves, like in Guatemala, call themselves the children of corn. And it's actually, what's interesting, one of the things I love about science is it keeps validating what we know in our hearts to be true. And we are the children of corn. We are corn, if you live in a corn country like America. And there was a biologist at UC Berkeley who tested the human hair of corn and found that 69% of the carbon in that human hair came from corn. I mentioned earlier the Wintu people, we talk about, they're a salmon culture. Did you know that there's salmon genes in the redwood trees in Northern California? Because the bears eat the salmon and they take it up to the trees. So this food system is a food web. It's part of who we really are. It's not just something out there. It's an intricate and intimate relationship. We know a little bit about how corn came to be. We don't know actually exactly yet in the genetics of it. The small little area on your left is teosinte, which is Nahuatl for the grain of the gods. Again, reaffirming this idea of the gift. We don't quite know much more than the teosinte and other grasses that came into corn as we know it, or maize, which is the way it's known in most of the world. But the origin stories, again, the creation stories of the people of corn have great explanations for how it happened, including that lightning hit it. That makes a lot of sense, actually, because when they were first making genetically engineered seeds, they were literally bombarding it with radiation to try and mutate the genes. So, it's really possible that these stories have some validity in science. We don't really know, but I'll tell you, here's the shocking truth about corn. Oh, and I just wanted to mention that this sort of, it looks like a struggle between these two guys, but I use it to illustrate the dance between people and plants, because out of that is what comes these important foods. I think of it as a dance that we do between us and the plants. But here's the real truth about corn. Corn is supported by almost $6 billion a year in annual subsidies in the U.S. And that doesn't include public road and water infrastructure or crop insurance. Crop insurance alone in 2012 was $20 billion. It's really important to understand that GMO corn, and 85% of corn grown in the United States is GMO, that this is a chemically dependent crop and it's subsidy dependent. Without these subsidies, we wouldn't have GMO agriculture, which is why I'm a great advocate of changing our farm bill and our farm policies to eradicate these production-based and chemical-based subsidies. I think farmers do need support, but we could support them as they do in European countries for conservation and for going organic. In the Netherlands, for instance, they have targets and they say, we're not going to tell you how to do it, but 5 years from now, the water is not going to have any more herbicides in it. You figure out how to do it, and we'll pay you every year for doing that. Use a yardstick. So they're farmer-friendly ways to support farmers, but also come out with a completely different vision for agriculture.